Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Jack Slack here, drinking a nice big cup of Earl Grey tea and recovering after the weekend of fights that was. We are now well into fight season. Fight season is open. We're going to keep going until the midpoint of October now. No weekends without fights, which as an English fight fan is hard because you have to stay up well into the morning on Sunday to actually watch the fights that take place on Saturday night. And then if you're me, you get up before you go to sleep because I rock this party 8 days a week. And then I write a piece on Monday and then I do a podcast on Tuesday. At any rate, how good is that Demian Maia, eh? He's always been one of my boys. So if you haven't heard, don't watch this podcast, but Demian Maia absolutely destroyed Carlos Condit. And it was one of those old school jiu-jitsu destructions. The old, you don't have to hit or hurt them. You just have to get them to the ground, get on their back, and choke them out. Carlos Condit's first submission loss inside the UFC. First submission loss in 10 years. First submission loss in a decade, which is ludicrous. That is the caliber of fighter, or grappler, we're talking about in Demian Maia. Well, a fighter. Let's call him a fighter, because he's challenging a lot of the notions we have about roundedness as a fighter. And the truth is that you don't need to be able to do everything. You just need to be able to deal with everything and get it to the one area of the game that you can do very, very well. And if you can do that against everyone, then you're set, you know? The problem is that most fighters have a ceiling on where their favourite game will be stopped. And most fighters, to be honest, if you're a great grappler, that is the window to the floor that's closed. If you watch Andre Galvao versus Tyron Woodley, which is a even more important fight to consider now that Maia versus Woodley is a possibility. Andre Galvao is one of the greatest grapplers who ever lived, but he's one of the greatest guard passers who ever lived. He plays guard well, but he's not going to pull guard on dudes, in a fight at least. And what happened in their fight was that Galvao tried to get him to the floor a few times. Woodley showed that wasn't going to happen, and then as Galvao's shots got lazier and lazier, Woodley started to hit him, and eventually TKO'd him. That might have been Galvao's last fight in MMA. I think he basically hung it up at that point. If you're a great grappler and you can't take the opponent down, and you're not willing to pull guard, or you aren't comfortable pulling yourself underneath this guy, you're in a lot of trouble. Whereas Demian Maia, his brilliance is that he grabs a hold of that single leg. His wrestling has improved in leaps and bounds. Most of his sweeps from the bottom are single legs. We joked about that last week. But if you can come up on the single, you watch guys like Chael Sonnen and Dan Henderson come up on the single from underneath guys, really bad positions, and they'll come up on the single and get top position. It's a very solid technique. In jiu-jitsu, the more favoured method is to improve position, get back to guard, do the safer things, incrementally improve position. But Maia is so special because he's improved his single leg so much, he gets in on it so quickly, and even if he can't get the guy down, he'll drop to his back for the guard, and then if he can't get the guy over the top of him to sweep him, he'll come back up on the single. It's a teeter-totter sort of thing where he goes back and forth between one and the other. He's a seamless combination of the wrestling and the pure grappling. He looked brilliant last night. He came out looking, pressuring Condit with his footwork, showing a jab that he was never ever going to use. Demian Maia doesn't typically punch people that much. He landed a really good left straight on Gunnar Nelson when Gunnar Nelson was getting tired and sort of standing in front of him, and Maia just lanced him up the centre with it. But most of the time, Maia is looking for the takedown, and he knows the opponent's looking for him to look for the takedown, so that's his pressure right there, built in, doesn't need to hit. Carlos Condit is a guy who throws a lot of punches and kicks. His kicks, he ends up throwing himself out of position a lot. I was expecting Maia to be looking to parry the kicks, but what happened was every time Condit showed something, Maia would leap back a little bit, then he'd move back in again, and it was Condit's second or third stance change. He changed stances right in front of Maia, and Maia immediately shot on the leg that was now out in front. So that must have been something that Maia's team had been preparing for. Condit does switch stances a lot. And the thing about switching stances generally is you want to do it in motion. So whether that be mid-combination, a shift, or a stutter step or something like that, or while you're moving side to side. Willie Pep used to do his side skipping. He'd start in a left stance and then he'd start skipping out to the side on his left. You know, the kind of way you'd circle the academy for BJJ or the gym for Muay Thai or something like that. The warm-up sort of side skipping. And then he'd suddenly have his right leg in front. A great example from MMA is Max Holloway versus Cub Swanson. When Holloway fought Swanson, he was using lateral movement to hide his stance changes very well, and he'd stance change into back kicks from the wrong side and all sorts of things. It was very interesting. But if you change stances directly in front of someone, normally there's a pause before you attack from your new stance. That's just something that everyone does. It just happens when you change stances. There's a moment where your feet aren't in position to strike, and then there's a moment afterwards where you're just getting set in your stance. If you're doing it in motion, that motion tends to hide it. At any rate, Mickey Ward had a fight a few years back where he changed stance in front of the guy, and the guy would just hit him right away with a power punch because Ward was standing still. But at any rate, Condit switched stances, and Maia was immediately on the lead leg and took him down, immediately tripoding. Tripoding is where you get up on your toes and either your head or your shoulder on the opponent. It's basically where your hips are as high as you can get them and still be stable. So what you're doing is you're basically using your upper body to pin the opponent to the floor and keeping your hips as high as you can so that they can't lock a guard around it again. Shinya Aoki does a lot of this. Go watch Gamble Dub's study on him. It's really interesting. And then a lot of the time what will happen is that because there isn't anything substantial to grab a hold of with your legs if you're the bottom man, you'll end up desperately looking for the trailing leg so that you want to consolidate a half guard. And Demian Maia and other guys who are great at passing from half guard, all they want is for you to consolidate a half guard. So you'll notice this when Demian Maia's passing. The opponent will finally fight and get that half guard, and Demian Maia will sit down and go, okay. Because the half guard is almost the mount. If you watch Roger Gracie, BJ Penn, Shinya Aoki, already mentioned him. Jacare does it a fair bit, actually. But there's a lot of guys who like to be in half guard just because it's so easy to pass to mount. And that's exactly what Maia did. He went reverse half guard for a little bit, and then he got back. Condit started fighting back. He tripoded again, got into more of a normal half guard because he had the cross face. And then he just slid his knee into three-quarter mount. Condit turned his back. Maia consolidated the back position, got the choke, finished it. Under 2 minutes. Just astounding stuff to do that to someone of Condit's level. And one of the interesting things about this fight coming in for me was how Condit's guard game would affect Maia's ability to pass. Because Condit, traditionally, has been not great at defending the takedowns, but always very aggressive from his back. So guys like Johnny Hendricks, Tyrone Woodley, they'll take him down, but then they'll end up fighting off triangles and things like that. And the triangles, when they posture up or try and shuck him off or whatever, they'll give him space to scramble up. Or a lot of the times he can take top position. Guys like him and Matt Brown and Martin Kampman, when he was around, they were very good at just attacking from the bottom rather than desperately trying to stay off the bottom. But, of course, Condit's whole game is getting into a more traditional closed guard and then attacking with techniques from there. Maia with his tripod and, he never chills in closed guard. There is no allowing the opponent to lock his legs around him. The opponent is always fighting to stop Maia passing and then settling for half guard when he doesn't. So that was that question answered thoroughly. There's not an awful lot more to say about this. I mean, I can wax lyrical about Demian Maia all day. It was a very moving fight because at the end Maia burst into tears because he's getting very old and he keeps getting better, but it's getting to the point where it's do or die. He's got to get the title shot or not. He's got a chance to be the champion of the world, and it could be that the order of title shots means that he can't do that. And then, of course, Carlos Condit was absolutely heartbroken by the loss, said in the post-fight interviews that he might not have it anymore. If I'm honest, I was thinking that Condit was probably on the way down around the Thiago Alves fight. I wrote this in an article this week, and I had lots of people jump down my throat with, but he destroyed Alves. But if you watch the first round of the Alves fight, he gets countered a lot. He's just getting lit up until he lands like the first really successful elbow, and then from there it's all downhill for Alves. But against Tyron Woodley, he didn't look that good either. But then he fought Robbie Lawler, and in another universe, this could have been a title defense. Carlos Condit, depending on who you are and how you score fights, could have beaten Robbie Lawler. It was a very, very close fight. There probably wasn't a decisive winner. On another night, Carlos Condit could have been welterweight champion. And here we are, one fight later, and he's talking about hanging it up. So very moving stuff. Very sad. But you never want to see a fighter carry on longer than they should. And a lot of the time that is because they want to carry on even when they shouldn't. Someone like a Diego Sanchez or someone like that. You definitely don't want to see a fighter carry on when they don't think they should carry on. Then you're getting into the point of why are you here? On a selfish level, I hope he changes his mind and feels reinvigorated and desperate to fight again. But if he doesn't want to fight, he shouldn't fight. There are too many guys just hanging around to get paychecks, and it's heartbreaking if you followed them through their career. Well, on that sort of somber note, we'll do some listener mail, and then we'll get back to the rest of the fights from the night. Thank you, everyone, for sending in your listener mail. I realised that in 4 episodes of this podcast, I have not once mentioned the address that you should email it to, so well done, everyone, for following through on that so well when I was so useless. The email address to send your podcast mail to is fightsgonepodcast@gmail.com. Alternatively, I do a little Facebook shout-out when I'm recording, and you can just put your short-form questions in there. Before we do the mail, just a reminder, we do have a Patreon page. Go to Patreon, type in Jack Slack or Fights Gone By. If you pledge $5 a month, you get put in for an extra episode each month, which will be a history episode. First episode of that is coming great. I'm dropping more hints each week, but it's going to be James Figg, the first champion of the world we're going to be talking about. Fascinating character, fascinating time, sort of the first real fighting celebrity. Well, outside of, ancient Greece or Rome, but the first modern fighting celebrity. And he was also very forward-thinking. He promoted the first women's fights, and was also kind of terrible in other ways. As I mentioned last week, one of the co-main events at his academy, or amphitheatre rather, was strapping explosives to a bull. And another one was a donkey being torn apart by dogs. So a very strange time to be alive, especially a strange time to be a fight fan. A lot harder to justify back then. Nowadays we can go, it's a beautiful art. And we just had to put up with the occasional Kimbo versus Dada 5000. Back then you had to try and justify the murdering of animals. So if you want to be in on that, get to Patreon, Jack Slack. Ain't gonna beg, but we're going to have a lot of fun with that one, and I'm really looking forward to it. Right, on to the questions. Hi, Jack. How do you think MMA would be different today if there were no gloves, just hand wraps? Would Hatsuhioki be UFC champion? I think the dirty secret of MMA is that 4-ounce gloves make the sport more dangerous, not less. What is your opinion? Thanks, Joseph. I think to a degree you're right. Yeah, they do. Well, it's no secret now that 4-ounce gloves don't protect the brain at all. They protect the hands. And that just makes it possible to punch harder. We're getting into stuff that I'm going to be covering in the first history episode. Plug for that again. Gloves were adopted when fighters realised, in the bare-knuckle days of boxing this is, when fighters realised that cuts on your face heal fairly quickly, broken fingers don't. Yeah, so there's a great story about Daniel Mendoza, who I idolise. One of the first truly scientific boxers. When he made his tour of Ireland, and there was a guy there called Squire Fitzgerald, who was a very accomplished sportsman, saw this small Jewish Englishman getting off the boat, said, I could probably take him. Went down to see Mendoza at one of his exhibitions, and challenged him. And Mendoza said, we'll only fight if you agree to wear the gloves. And this Fitzgerald guy really wasn't having it. And they went back and forwards about this forever. And Mendoza was quite comfortable to say, I'm not going to fight you if I'm not wearing the gloves. And at the time, that was thought to be Mendoza being like, I don't want to take this guy's punches. It was more a case of Mendoza could get a lot more money to fight real opponents. And, even if he beat the crap out of Fitzgerald, which he did in the gloves, by the way, he would have mullered his hands doing it. Throwing your hands into someone's skull is not conducive to hand health. And continuing on that theme, the first fighters in UFC to adopt gloves, they weren't made to, they chose to because they wanted to hit harder with their fists. Gloves appeal mainly to the squeamish people in the audience. If you fight bare knuckle, there will be a lot of cuts because you're going hard knuckles on thin skin of face. And people don't like cuts. They think, oh my god, how brutal. Everyone's bleeding everywhere. But obviously, if you've watched any boxing or anything like that, you know the majority of the big cuts come from clashes of heads because you've got bone on bone with a little bit of skin separating it. The padding of the gloves doesn't protect in any way against head trauma, brain trauma. All it does is prevent cuts. So a lot of people now think that the gloves in boxing actually cause more injury, long-term damage, than if we just fought bare knuckle. Obviously, there's a middle ground because if you don't wear gloves, you're getting your hands messed up. Actually, I really appreciated at the Olympics this year they have dropped the headgear because headgear is another one. Rather than protecting the head from blows, it protects the skin and adds weight to the head, which bobbles around every time you hit it. So you're not protecting the brain from forceful trauma. Obviously, I'm not a medical doctor. I will defer to anyone. Well, I'll defer to anyone who shares my view and is a medical doctor. No, there's a lot of studying to be done, but anything with head trauma is very difficult to do because you can't traumatize someone's head in a lab environment just to see how that works. But it's similar to the situation that you guys are facing with American football over there, where it turns out that if you give people more padding, it just encourages them to run into each other harder. It doesn't actually protect their brain from being shaken around while they're doing it. They just don't feel it on the outside. Realistically, it's something you just have to come to terms with it. Everyone who knows fighting knows that bare knuckle would probably result in less head trauma because you have to pick your shots more carefully, you have to use your open hands a lot more. If you watch Letway, I put up a clip of that a couple of weeks ago, they allow headbutts and they wear just the hand wraps, as you were saying. Joseph, that is, the you I'm referring to. And there's a lot more hitting of the body, and they use what's called the bull's guard. I don't know what the name is in Burmese, but apparently it translates to bull's guard, which is where you get your elbows up, just like Nate Diaz was doing to Conor McGregor. You get your elbows up and your forearms in front of you, but you project your forehead so that anytime they're throwing in straight punches, they're colliding with just the forehead. None of the soft stuff on the face, none of the jawline, just that big piece of bone that is a lot harder than your knuckles. What you'd have is the guys who hit the body very well would do great. The guys who kick very well would do great. The guys who'd be losing out would be probably the guys who throw a lot of combinations against the opponent's guard and things like that. The guys who work in volume, because you just have to be so much more judicious without the gloves. I mean, if you watched the New York State Assembly debate on legalizing MMA, it's very clear for a start that nobody has a fucking clue what MMA is. It was just the worst 2 or 3 hours of my life watching that shit. You just realise that people are willing to stand up and express their very strong opinion about something that they haven't even educated themselves on. I mean, some of them seem to think that it was bare knuckle anyway. A lot of the people who were arguing in favour of MMA, professional MMA being legalised, were talking about nunchucks and stuff and how great their kids were because they practice martial arts. Most of them didn't seem to realise that they weren't legalising MMA. You can still fight in New York, you just can't get paid for it. Charles Barron, I think his name was, an old black guy, decided to liken professional mixed martial arts to making slaves fight. And this guy, he was just awful. Look him up, because he then likened it to the Eric Garner case. He said, you know how we feel about the chokehold in New York. And then he seemed to think that people were allowed to bite each other in MMA. The public perception of MMA is so bad to begin with, I would not want more blood and less protection for the hands. It's just something that we as fight fans have to accept. There is probably a safer way of doing this. But because of the squeamishness of the people who get to choose whether or not we are allowed to watch this, That will never happen. That was long-winded, but I hope I sort of answered that. Cheers, Joseph. Jack, please, please, please share any books you've enjoyed on the sweet science. Thanks. And that's from Joshua. My favourite book of all time, probably, is Norman Mailer's The Fight, which is just a terrific account of Mailer's time in the run-up to the Rumble in the Jungle, the fight between George Foreman and Muhammad Ali in Zaire. If you're a fight journalist or a fight writer, that's the one you look up to. That's the one you say, God, I wish they did fights like that nowadays. Even though it was a very strange time, it was a very strange thing going on. Don King got Muhammad Ali and George Foreman to agree to fight if he could get them $5 million each, which was unheard of at the time. And the place that he found that money was Zaire, which had just been liberated and then become a dictatorship under Mobutu. And Mobutu was happy to pledge 10 million to this fight to get the name of Zaire on the map. And basically what happened was, in the lead up to the fight, the world sent its press out to Zaire. So you had people like Hunter S. Thompson and George Plimpton and Norman Mailer all hanging out in the one hotel there, along with all the members of the Black Music Festival that was going on at the same time. So you had B.B. King, James Brown, Big Black, the conga player who played an instrument called a conga, which is a big drum, and he was interviewed about it, and they asked him what he played. He said, I play the conga, but this was while the Zaire press were censoring out any use of the word Congo, because it was formerly the Congo. So he ended up playing the Zaire in the magazine interview. But you just had all these celebrities from the literary world and from the music world walking around in the same hotel lobby with guys like Archie Moore and Dick Sadler, George Foreman's team and Muhammad Ali's team. And it got a bit more complicated because a cut got opened up on Foreman, and then the Zairis weren't going to let the fighters leave. They were going to delay the fight, but keep them all in the country. And Mailer's account of it is just absolutely fantastic. If you've seen the film When We Were Kings, it really meshes well with that. There's a lot of Mailerisms in it. He professes that Ernest Hemingway is his idol, but he writes with nothing like the simplicity. He'll say things like, to reach the edge of the heart of darkness, here at the old capital of Joseph Conrad's horror, this Kinshasa, once evil Leopoldville, centre of the slave trade and ivory trade, and to see it through the bilious eyes of a tortured intestine. That's him describing getting the shits on the plane. So he can go a little bit off with that sort of stuff, but he was very friendly with Ali. Went out for morning road work at about 4 a.m. or something like that in the Zaire nighttime. And he was going through an interesting point in his life too. He just signed $1 million book deal, so he'd become a bit famous on his own right. It's just a terrific account of the entire affair. And Mailer is as much of a mark for Archie Moore as I am. So he spent a lot of the camp trying to get to know Archie Moore and not get hustled at ping pong by him and things like that. Great book. Norman Mailer's The Fight. Look it up. I really enjoyed Hands of Stone, the biography of Roberto Duran, with a lot of Duran's own remarks in it. Really long interview with him. Terrific book. Unforgivable Blackness, the book that the Ken Burns documentary was based on, is truly fantastic. As a fight historian, that's one you got to read, because there are very few fighters, spare maybe Muhammad Ali and Joe Louis, that had as much impact on the world at large as Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion of the world. It's worth also noting that Mailer wrote The Death of Perret, which is considered one of the great boxing essays. That's about the death of Benny the Kid Perret at the hands of Emil Griffith, who he called whatever the Spanish equivalent of a faggot is. He called him that, and Emil Griffith was apparently bisexual his entire life. He only came out very near the end of his life. We're talking 2 or 3 years ago, and then he died. But he was very secretive about his love life and personal life, and to be fair, any celebrity should be allowed to be secretive about their love life, and it was a different time. We thankfully have gay boxers who are out nowadays, and and quite a few gay female MMA fighters. We're waiting for a major male MMA fighter to come out, but it's just quite a brave thing to do if you are the first gay one to say that you are. So anyway, Perret got beaten to death by Griffith in the ring, and the mailer account of it is pretty haunting. I would recommend everyone read that. In fact, I would recommend everyone watch that. Because if you're a serious fight fan, like, it's not part of the game you want to watch people die, but you need to understand that this is a sport where you can be legally beaten to death. And watch the fight, read the essay. If you followed my work for any amount of time, you will not be surprised that one of the best boxing manuals that I've ever read was Edwin Hazlitt, who I consider the Bible of striking, basically. His book is it's sort of a compendium of everything that he'd seen before as a boxing coach for a very successful, I think it was a high school team, might have been a collegiate team. The most interesting thing about Hazlitt's book is that he was such a successful coach, but he also allowed a good deal of personal preference in his charges. So he had a list of, I think it was 8 counters to the jab that he considered the most important, and he said that he liked his students to master 2 of them. And then he had he made a list of counterpunches that he liked, and he said that there were over like 700 possible variations of counterpunch that he could think of. And he said that any student should master 2 more of their choice from that 700 counters, basically. It's a really interesting approach to teaching. You say these are the most important ones, but you get your choice, and then the rest of it is up to you. And also, John Walsh was his rival for a while. They had competing boxing teams, and they went back and forward on a lot of like school level Golden Gloves championships. And John Walsh's book came out a little bit later, I think. That's called Boxing Simplified, and it's not nearly as good a book, but it does have some sections where it says this is quite a common strategy, and you'll think, oh yeah, that's an Edwin Hazlitt. Another couple of books that I love are the Champ Thomas series of boxing books. They've been compiled into a pair of books now called How to Be an Ass-Whipping Boxer and Outlaw Killer Punches, I think was the other one. Both of them are terrific. Quite hard to get a hold of new. They haven't made them in years, actually, but quite hard to get a hold of altogether. Very expensive books. I think one of them's online. You'll have to have a look around. But basically, Thomas was a carnival boxer. And carnival boxers and wrestlers are really interesting people to get techniques from, because while they don't have the techniques necessarily to beat the top professionals in one night, their techniques are always sort of built around keeping them safe, because they're going to be going against 10, 15 dudes each night. So weirdly enough, Thomas's series is also probably the best written material you're ever going to find on what he calls the stone wall, the shoulder roll, the side-on guard. I think people call it the Philly shell now, apparently because it was in one of the EA Sports Fight Night games. I prefer stone wall, but whatever you want. The side-on behind the shoulder style. And Thomas's whole game was basically hard body jabs, even, which, to be fair, when you say it like that, it sounds a lot like Floyd Mayweather's game. His basic opening the opponent up punch was the body jab, and he'd hide behind his lead shoulder and use that stone wall so effectively. But there are also great sections in Thomas's book just about dealing with roughhouse tactics and delivering roughhouse tactics of your own. He was a big advocate of the when the opponent bends forward at the waist, you throw a right hook that you deliberately miss across the top of their head, and you just slam your forearm down on the back of their neck. Ray Safo did that to Bob Sapp during their fight. It's a nasty piece of work, that punch, and he's just got a whole book full of them. He's saying things. I got a question in the mailbag this week. It didn't make it through, sorry. But I got a question about striking with the forearms and wrists, what they call koteuchi, I believe, in karate. But yeah, if you look at like the inside of your wrist, just swinging that into someone's head, And Champ Thomas was a big advocate of if the opponent's covering up, just swing your wrist into their wrist and see if you can do some damage. Great series of books, and he's so full of shit too. It's just fantastic. It's like your granddad when he'd tell you that he saw a band before they were famous, or he once gave a knockdown punch to a world champion who came to town, and he only trained sometimes, just absolutely full of bollocks, but really quite a clever guy. He knew how to sell himself. The flim flam. Well, Jesus, the more I say about him, the more he sounds like Floyd Mayweather in another life. Continuing on the personal method of boxing sort of theme, I'm a big fan of Georges Carpentier. His book called My Method, Boxing as a Fine Art, is really interesting. He was the founder of what they called the French School of, what he called the French School of Boxing. At the start of the 1900s, the French didn't give much of a shit about boxing. They cared more about savate. But there was a big war going on between the English method of upright boxing, Jim Driscoll, Jimmy Wilde, jab, move away, a gentleman never engages in the infight, and then the American school of boxing, which was to get to the infight and hit with both hands. And Carpentier, being an outside observer with none of the jingoism or patriotism or whatever, he was the first guy to really start combining them both, because he didn't have a dog in the fight. And he fought I think he's the only fighter to have fought in every weight class, because he started boxing when he was like 12 years old professionally or something like that. So he was right down by minimum weight, and worked his way all the way up to a heavyweight title shot at one point against Jack Dempsey, and was a war hero and all sorts of other stuff. Really interesting guy. But his book basically, it's more like his own personal musings on boxing, and the most interesting thing is how he treats each fight as an individual thing. He's not like we talk a lot about fighters who ask a lot of questions, like their style has specific questions for each opponent they face, and then we talk about fighters who bring the answers. And Carpentier was a guy who preferred to prepare something special for whoever he was fighting, rather than rely on the old stuff that he uses in every fight. So there's a good account of his fight with Bomber Wells and all sorts of other things, just folding behind the elbows. He's got about 4 different guards in the book, where he's like, oh, when I was fighting so and so with a very good left hook to the liver, I made sure I was using this guard and that guard and all the other stuff. And he also he recounts punches that knocked him down. He says, looking back, maybe I should have done this, but I certainly learned an interesting technique from getting knocked down by that. Really special guy, Georges Carpentier. Very good book. Gene Tunney is another guy with a remarkably candid book available. His book was called A Man Must Fight. He was famous for being the man who beat Dempsey. And the American public didn't warm to him as much as they did Dempsey, because Dempsey was he was a gentleman at all times, except when he was fighting, and he was an absolute murderer. And when he did knock out Carpentier, he bound across the ring to pick him up immediately and check on him and raise his hand and all that sort of stuff. Tunney, he never had that killer instinct. He was always more of a mover. Some people credit him with inventing circling out, because he had to fight Jack Dempsey in like a 16-foot ring or something like that. That was when they were still allowing you to like dictate the ring size as the champion. And he used to quote Shakespeare a lot, and he was a real reader. Idolized Gentleman Jim Corbett, and like they shared diagrams of footwork and things like that. But his book it's not like a technical manual. It is an account of his life. But he talks about his decisions in the ring. He said, I don't like turning my hips into my punches. I just like to push my punches out from the arm, because I find they get there quicker and they do the job of snapping someone's head back while I run away. And of course, it's one of the best accounts you'll read of Harry Greb, because Gene Tunney had a pair of fights with Harry Greb, and Harry Greb is probably, if you ask fight historians who they wish there was film of, I'd always say someone like Kid McCoy, but most people would say Harry Greb, and I would agree, because he was supposed to be incredible. He was just a whirlwind of motion. So yeah, that's definitely worth a read. I've prattled on for a while about boxing books. You could say Pierce Egan's Boxiana, very famous compilation of all his sort of work. AJ Liebling is the other one that everyone always goes on about, This Week's Science. There's a ton of stuff about it. Ask me again next week. In fact, ask me about any sort of books, because I've got heaps of them just behind me, and I love recommending them to people. Returning to the fights from the other night, Paige VanZant, highlight reel knockout, kick to the face, jumping kick to the face. The same one that her teammate, Andre Fili, one of my boys, got caught with by Yair Rodriguez. The same one that Yair Rodriguez throws 80 times every fight. It was interesting to watch Paige VanZant fight like that. You still had the hyperactive movement, the use of tons of energy, but this time it was in sort of an evasive capacity rather than overwhelming capacity. She was using nice low kicks to the outside of Bec Rawlings' lead leg, but she was still also throwing those sort of useless side kicks and front kicks that she was throwing out against Rose Namajunas that were getting her countered. Bec Rawlings parried a couple of body kicks very nicely and came back with her boxing. Stayed out of the clinch nicely when VanZant tried to slap it on. Really, for most of the first round, you thought, nice low kicks, but why is Paige VanZant sort of swinging at air an awful lot of the time? And then first thing in the second round, she comes out, attempts that same low-high jumping switch kick from 2 feet closer and scores it straight on the face, TKO. I don't want to say that I've seen huge technical improvement in Paige VanZant because her hands still looked very bad, and she was still throwing weird kicks from way out of range. But she did also stick to her game plan perfectly. The low kicks were working. She listened to her coaches, and she got the. I mean, the exciting TKO was the least important part. The important part was that she doesn't need to overwhelm people with aggression and risk all that damage, and giving her back trying to hit those weird head throws. So she's 22 years old. She's a baby in this sport. There's tons of time for her to get better. And props to her, because if you could be doing anything else, and if you're a pretty girl, you could be doing anything else, and you've been on TV and Dancing with the Stars, props to you if you come back and you fight a legit female fighter and you win, and win impressively. Lauzon versus Miller was a really fun one. The second fight the second fight after a fight of the night performance is always a tentative one, because you can't be expecting the same thing as the first. The reason that the first fight was so great was because both of them took a kicking in that fight, and you had to know both of them were coming in going, okay, how can I put the offense more towards me rather than that guy hitting me just as much as I hit him. So Miller, he had those, the grab in the back of the head and elbowing, the Naihanchi style elbows in the first fight. Didn't really go for those as much. Lauzon was trying to hit him with nice long right straights down the centre and backing him up into the cage. Miller was really working the body. It felt like, I'm guessing that Donald Cerrone's amazing work to Miller's body maybe woke him up to the possibility of the body shots being so important. And if that's what it takes to get people using body shots, we just need to make a chain where everyone gets their ass kicked by body shots at some point. But I thought that was a really interesting idea, because even if you are backing up and then throwing the occasional body shot or two and then backing up some more, constantly moving forward takes a fair amount of effort, and because you have to be conscious that you're stepping into striking range every single time. Stepping forward is a lot more work than circling the cage, to be honest, if you're trying to stay defensively sound and whatnot. So those were really nice. Lauzon got the takedowns. It was great to see them both on the ground, because they're both improving on the feet, trying to work out what works best against the other man. But you got to see just the level of the guys on the ground in those brief moments. Like Lauzon very quickly took mount off one of the takedowns, and within a second, Miller had hit the knee to elbow back into half guard, getting the knee shield in, and then Lauzon was already passing to another attempt at mount. So the level of grappling that these guys possess is just so much above what most fighters would show in that sort of fight. So that was really cool. The judging was a bit contentious. I mean, 3-round fights that go to decision typically are. There's always this danger because 3 rounds is not a lot to get ahead on the cards, even if you win some rounds quite clearly. And it only takes a judge to be in a bad position or a couple of judges to be in a bad position, and the result might not reflect the fight at all. I mean, there isn't time for it, but I'm always a big advocate of 5-round fights for everyone. You know, they could say 7 for title fights, but you don't even need that. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous that you have these flyweights fighting on the curtain jerkers of cards, and then suddenly they're going from a 3-round fight to almost double the length fight against Demetrius Johnson, who's done that several times before. Obviously, a lot of these fights he's winning inside the distance, but it just seems ridiculous that you can get a title shot without ever having to be scheduled, at least, for a 5-round fight. And then my favourite fight of the night was Anthony Pettis versus Charles Oliveira. Charles Oliveira, the front headlock king. Tie clinch, tie clinch. Double collar tie, very strong in that position. Nice elbows, nice knees. He immediately started shooting on Pettis, and he got him down, and he got his back several times. What you were seeing was Pettis' wrestling still letting him down, or getting stuck to the fence is Pettis' problem. I mean, it's not always his wrestling, it's the fact that he struggles to get off the fence. Which is, wrestling, but it's not like he's getting taken down and held there. Also, he is so comfortable on his back that he does spend a little bit too much time there, where other fighters would be desperately scrambling up. But Pettis' BJJ chops were showing through very well. Basically, Oliveira kept getting his back, and where that would be a death sentence for a lot of fighters, Pettis just kept shrugging out, ending up in closed guard on top. So it was a very strange fight in that regard, and you can't underestimate the effect of taking someone's back repeatedly and not being able to do anything. There were no moments in that fight where he was trapping the arm, or he got the body triangle in for a long period of time and he was almost there under the chin. It was always get the back, scramble for a bit, try and hold on to him, and then Pettis would get out or get on top. So that's got to be very draining on your confidence if you're Oliveira. A couple of the lovely Pettis body kicks. Very few fighters kick the body as well as Pettis does. He was using a shorter stance this time, it looked like. It might have been the camera angle. There were a couple of weird ones last night where the camera was behind one fighter for a length of time. If you're filming a fight, bad camera position is directly behind one of the fighters, because you want to see what both are doing, really, so you want right in between them. It's bad camera position is pretty much the same as bad reffing position. As the ref, you want to sort of be able to see them from the side on of the engagement rather than behind one man where you can't see the other guy. He's obscured by the guy you're behind's back. And the finish of that fight was a strange one too. Pettis came off the bottom of side control, gave up his back trying to escape, and wound up guillotining Oliveira as Oliveira kept trying to hold onto his hips. A very strange finish, but if you've got a guillotine that's good, I was singing the praises of guillotines last week, but or it might have been the week before, but it's just so powerful. There are very few submissions that have that many chances for you to get them on. It only takes a little bit of sloppiness on the part of the guy who's holding onto your leg or shooting after your hips. If they're a little bit tired and their head's down, that's them done. If you shoot a bad takedown on Alistair Overeem, you're going to get choked out. Whereas a lot of the more successful submissions in MMA competition nowadays, triangles have sort of dropped off the face of the earth, but a lot of them are sort of grinding submissions from top position, arm triangles, especially arm triangles from mount, arm triangles from the top of half guard, the occasional arm bar from the bottom, things like that. But a lot of those are sort of grinding, set them up, force them into the position sort of submissions. Guillotines are the ones that really change fights quickly. Something that Oliveira was doing that I quite liked was he threw out a few front kicks with his lead leg, but he was doing a nice job of just picking his lead leg up as if he was going to front kick and then stepping in, like sliding in behind it, gliding in on one leg. And that's really good against kickers because if you've got that knee up in the way, there's also that can collide with all sorts of strikes that the opponent's throwing at you. It jammed one of Pettis' kicks at one point. And it's just a great way of getting in. And that's something that I would have liked to see from Benson Henderson in the Bellator event. He was fighting Patricio Freire, Pitbull, one of the Pitbulls. Freire looked fairly good, but Henderson kept walking him to the fence. And the thing is that Henderson, he can drive a really high pace. He's got cardio for days. And when he put the pace on guys like Rustam Kabalov, Brandon Thatch, when he put the pace on those guys, he just melted them. You know, Brandon Thatch in the first round was able to outmuscle him by being a huge welterweight. Fourth round, Thatch could do nothing to keep him off him. The problem is that Henderson came out looking quite tentative. He was standing back, and he doesn't really have like a long-range weapon to build off of. You know, you could have in kickboxing, you might have a lead leg push kick, a teep. Boxing, you might have a jab. Or, you know, McGregor does the same with his left straight. That's his long sniping weapon. That's the thing that he gets the points up with. He hits them with from distance. Low kicks, same thing. The low line side kick. I mean, these are all things that Henderson shows, but he doesn't really have one that he commits to and then builds off of. And he showed the low line side kick a couple of times. And I think that would be a really useful weapon for him to really build with, because then you can start picking up that leg and instead just sliding in behind it into punching range, while the opponent is either picking up their leg or covering up. And that would have really helped him against a guy like Pitbull, where the main warrior is getting counterpunched as you step in. I mean, everyone's saying that Henderson didn't look great. He looked tentative, I'll definitely say that. Freire got a takedown at one point, which was fairly impressive, given who Henderson is and the size difference. But you did see all those kicks that Freire was throwing, a lot of them connecting on the shin or the very top of the shin. Henderson was checking most of them, and that's where most reckon the shin break happened. I mean, it's hard to break your shin in half, you know. So that's probably where the shin break happened. And you got to give Henderson the props for checking the kicks and for that to happen. That's what happens if you don't set up your kicks. We said this when Anderson Silva did it, even when Tyrone Spong did it, and Ray Safo. If you don't set up your kicks and you kick them in the shin, you know, you don't get a no contest for getting injured. You get a loss because your leg got broken on their defense. Krokop said some interesting stuff about this. He said he didn't like the low kicks because kick to the head or the body, you know, you can put them away instantly. Kicks to the leg, you gotta throw several of them, land a few good low kicks to do any damage, and they can check one, and that's your leg broken. If you're unlucky, obviously. But that's one of the things about throwing full power leg kicks. If you watch one of the masters like Ernesto Hoost, he always kicked on the end of a combination when he had his opponent like covering up, or when they were stepping forwards, which is a little bit more dangerous in MMA because your shin can ride up their thigh into their hip and they'll just take you down. But that was when he knew that their foot had to be on the ground when they were stepping in, so he used to do a lot of that. That's one of the things that Ernesto Host talks about in those seminars online all the time. He's always saying it was very important to me to not kick their shin. Because you watch Ernesto Host and you're like, wow, he's just magic. He can just kick through anything. But he didn't want to kick people's shins. He wanted to kick them in the leg where they couldn't defend themselves. One other fight worth talking about from that Bellator event was Chinzo Machida. People are asking me if he's going to be the next big thing. He's not. If he thinks he's going to be the next big thing, he's wrong, because he's older than Lyoto. He's coming up on 40. He's just not got that many fights in him left. Even if he does amazing things over the next few months, if you're the UFC, you're not even bothering to look at him. You know, you're not going to get anything out of your investment in that guy, aside from a few really good knockouts. But don't let that put you off watching him. He's terrific, and a great fighter for Bellator to have on staff. I'm not going to write an article about this. If you're wondering why I don't write Bellator stuff, it's because at the moment they seem to be taking down all the gifts that aren't their own ones. They said to us, apparently, they said to my bosses that they would like us to use their pre-selected highlight gifs. And that's not how it works. If the UFC only let me use highlight gifs, I wouldn't write the articles, because that's just hyping up their product. You know, we're talking about the good stuff and the bad stuff. Do you think they'd want me writing about how Ronda Rousey always runs in behind her face and can't really cut off the ring, and when a boxer starts circling out on her, she'll have trouble? No, they'd want me to say like Ronda Rousey is unbeatable. So yeah, until Bellator realise that that's not how that works, and they respect that, I can't be asked to write articles about them. But anyway, Chinzo Machida, aside from the awesome uppercut finish, what you should watch that fight for, he used a really interesting hip feint to set up his low kicks. He'd fake with his hips like he was going to do an inside low kick from a very long stance. And then he'd immediately kick with the rear leg outside low kick when his man was ready for the inside low kick. Really nice little technique. I'm a sucker for double kicks. I love it when Brandon Thatch was doing that to Gunnar Nelson. He was kicking inside and then kicking outside as that leg came down from being kicked. But the other interesting thing about Machida is I'm gonna compare him to Sammy Schilt, who I wrote an article about, I think last week. Obviously, very different fighters, very different styles of karate. Schilt is much more plodding. He'll step up and throw the left leg front kick to the body to wind guys, and then he'll come down with the jab off the same side. And that front kick to the body sets up the round kick upstairs later, the head kick. And Chinzo Machida was doing that from a much longer stance with a little bit more sort of in and out movement because he's a Shotokan style karateka. He took like second in, I think it was the JKA Cup in Sydney. He was against Ogata in the final, so trained with Ogata a few years ago. He's terrific. He's got quite fat now, but he's a really fast guy, really fast footwork. He really stressed sneaking your back foot from that long stance up underneath you so that you've got a point to drive off of which is closer to the opponent than they think it is, so you can make more distance. Really clever stuff. Like, I mean, it's coming into style now in MMA, but getting across the floor quickly, there's a lot of ways to do it. There's a lot of guys who bounce a lot, and there's a lot of different ways to sneak up that back leg, and Ogata's was really interesting. But, yeah, so watch out for that front kick to the body. That's a favourite of Masahiko Tanaka, one of the very old school JKA instructors. Probably, I suspect he was a large part of the training of Lyoto's father, who was a JKA guy. Tanaka taught the instructor's course for a while. His favourite was a lead leg front snap kick straight out of that long stance. So you wouldn't think it was a very powerful kick. But you'll see Bill Wallace and even Jean-Claude Van Damme talk about this. That kick straight out of the stance into the rib pisses people off. And then it sets up the high kick later, and he did a really nice one of those. But the finish came as his man, I can't remember his name, sorry. His man was sort of covering up and ducking, and he showed it really obviously when Chinzo feinted at him. And if you show a striker of that ability, you know, Chinzo's not a boxer, but he knows when a guy bends forward like that, you've got to hit him from underneath. So you'd have expected either that front kick to the face, you know, the old Machida special, or the uppercut. And he loaded up that uppercut for days, but, you know, all he had to do was throw out a loose jab, that guy ducked, bam, under the chin, took his head off. And he even ki'd. That's those years of karate competition. Because while Lyoto was rounding out his game from quite an early age, Chinzo was much more focused on like karate competition. Like I said, he got to the finals of the JKA Worlds. So the ki as he punched was pretty cool. Really interesting guy. I would love to see him get as many fights as possible now before he's too old to. Because honestly, it's a gift to us, the fight fans, to have a guy like him fighting. Right, I've prattled on here for a while. We're getting towards the end of our budgeted time. But let's talk about UFC Fight Night 93, Arlovski versus Barnett. This is in Hamburg, Germany. I didn't bother getting tickets, even though it's an okay card. Right, so we'll go from bottom to top of sort of like the main card area. Oh, okay. Rustam Kabalov, who I mentioned earlier, and whose name I have managed to butcher on about 3 of our 4 podcasts, despite him not being that well known, versus Leandro Silva. Silva's an interesting guy. He's had cardio issues in the past. He has one of the most interesting tells I've ever seen on a fighter of such a high level. When he gets ready to punch, he like shows all his teeth, well, his gum shield. He bares his teeth and then he punches. And it looks very strange when you watch him fight. He's sort of worked on it in his last few performances, but the first couple of fights he had in the UFC, it was very obvious, and it looked very strange. It was like a weird tick. Rustam Kabalov, one of the Dagestanis, fantastic wrestler, does that Dagestani backstep, which is either genius or very dangerous and not intended at all, where he stands with his back foot to the fence, and then as soon as the opponent steps in, he shoots. That's the sort of stuff that guys like Anthony Pettis used to love, to try and knee guys in the head as they shot on him when he backed them towards the fence. He had that rough loss versus Benson Henderson when Benson just put the pace on him, melted him. Lovely Prince Nazim corkscrew uppercut to left straight for the finish, and then the choke with no hooks in. Very impressive. Lost a split decision to Adriano Martins, who's good. Beat Norman Park and Chris Wade. So he's on a 2-fight win streak, fighting Leandro Silva. Silva's on a 1-fight losing streak, which is not really a streak at all. Should be an alright fight. I would expect the wrestler to have the success here. While Silva does have 10 wins by submission, aside from Charlie Brenneman, he's not really submitted that many great wrestlers. I'll be honest, not a very important fight. Ryan Bader versus Ilir Latifi. Bader is in that weird spot where he knows his chin's not the best. Everyone else knows his chin's not the best. He's got a huge power in his hands, but he's very reluctant to throw them because he doesn't want to get clipped on the chin. If you saw his fight against Anthony Johnson, his disastrous fight with Anthony Johnson, that was his last fight, that was in January. He built up this head of steam through 6 victories, all decisions. And he came out and did nothing except for shoot for the takedown. He went straight for the leg. It was not a good shot. It wasn't set up at all. Johnson just sprawled on him and murdered him from there. It honestly just seemed like he was terrified. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe it was part of some plan to set up punches later or something like that, show a really obvious shot and then come up with punches later. But it just seemed like a desperation shot straight off the bat. Against Ilir Latifi, I mean, Latifi hits hard, but he's not the most polished striker in the world. You know, if Bader can catch Glover Teixeira with left hooks inside of his right hand, he can probably deal with Ilir Latifi, who's got a very short reach for his weight class anyway, and a very short guy, and doesn't do himself any favours by only really swinging circular shots rather than straights anyway. Latifi hasn't fought since March in that awful fight against Gian Villante. I mean, anything he did before that, he had 2 victories by TKO before that, against Sean O'Connell and Hans Stringer, who are good fighters, but anything he did before that was immediately erased from my mind by that dreadful performance against Villante, which neither man did anything much. It was just a long wall and stall. You'd think that being such a strong wrestler and hitting so hard, this is Latifi's chance to sort of make a case for being a top 10 sort of fighter. Especially with the division as weak as it is. To be honest, he might even be in the top 10 already. I haven't checked, but the division is desperately weak. Yep, from Latifi, you'd probably want to see holding off the shots and then trying to land the uppercuts as the shots come slower. From Bader, you desperately want to see him get back to punching into his shots and shooting and just showing the shots into the punches. He used to be obsessed with the left hook into the right uppercut. For many fights, that was basically all he did, and he was starching dudes with it. And then as his coaches tried to sharpen him up, he only really became more tentative. Like there was a reluctance to let his hands go. So you hope that he gets his confidence back and shows everyone just how good he can be and just how dangerous he can be without having to hold the guy down. Because this is a hard sport to be great in if you have to be the front runner. You can't get everyone to the mat right away, and you got to have a backup plan if you can't, you know, unless you're Demian Maia, and then you just fall down underneath them and you'll still be able to get up and sweep them. Alexander Gustafsson takes his tune-up against Jan Blachowicz. I can't even say his name. Should be interesting enough. That's Jan. That's Jan's big chance to show everyone what he's got. You hope this works out for Gustafsson because, I mean, he's had some gimmies. He got that fight against Jimmy Manuwa, but he's also had some really rough fights. Like he's gone through a murderer's row with Jones, DC, and Rumble. Those 3 guys haven't all faced each other, but Gustafsson's faced every single one, and he lost to every single one in and against Jones and DC. You know, he could have been the light heavyweight champion twice over by now with different judges. You know, even if you thought the decision went the right way, it could have easily gone the other way. Things to watch out for from Gustafsson: the very long uppercut with the rear hand can be dangerous if you're up against a good left hooker. But he does have such a reach on most of the guys he fights. And if not a reach, height advantage, remember those combine in a range advantage. We're not just talking about the length of his arms. The interesting thing about Gustafsson is that he's always been a tall guy who wants to box a bit shorter than he is. Like he'll move in on guys and give up his range advantage on shorter guys. Where against John Jones, a guy with sort of an equal reach to him, he fought that way and it turned out perfectly. He was putting together beautiful combinations. It was like he'd been waiting his whole life to meet someone John Jones' size. I really like Gus. But the knees from the double collar tie are a terrific weapon for him against shorter guys. The uppercut really works especially well against shorter guys. It's his kicking game that tends to get him into trouble. He's had kicks parried and countered by all three of the big three guys. The Rumble Johnson obviously knocked him down after his coach called for a front kick and Rumble heard it. DC obviously countered some of those kicks nicely, but not as nicely as Jones did, who parried a few with the kicks and came back with hard kicks of his own. Though that was one of the commendable things about Gustafsson's fight with John Jones. He's not the most gifted kicker in the world, but by kicking back, he gave Jones another thing to think about. There's too much of this in MMA, where if a guy's a really good kicker, people go, oh, well, he can't kick with him. But they're just a tool, you know? You don't have to be an Esto Hoost to benefit from throwing some low kicks. Because if they pick their leg up, if you kick their leg, you've got a good chance of holding them in place while you move in. If they pick their leg up and check, which is exactly what a good kickboxer will do, they're still on one leg for a moment. You can move in and start doing your other stuff. So there's very few fighters in MMA who can't benefit from kicking, even if they're shit at it. And then, of course, in the main event, you've got Arlovski versus Barnett. Arlovski's chin is world famous now for being... well, let's not call the guy's chin shoddy, because he's taken heavyweight punches. His chin is just not outstanding for a heavyweight. Obviously, ate the right hand down the pipe from Stipe Miocic, and then the crane kick from Alistair Overeem. It was the left hook afterwards that did it. Everyone expected him to go out on the crane kick, but he stood there and seemed almost surprised himself, and then got left hooked on the jaw. The thing about Arlovski is, like, he's the same as Bader. The more he worked with a top quality boxing coach, Freddie Roach, the more he was taught to box scientifically and conservatively, the less he threw his right hand. And a lot of the time it was his right hand that kept people from just walking in on him and trying to swing at his chin when it's got such a reputation. If you watch guys like Brett Rogers just swarm in on him because he was trying to jab and move. Sergei Haratanov too, not a tremendous technical striker, but brilliant with the one hand, and he just walked through Arlovski's punches, basically, and starched him. Arlovski's last win was against Frank Mir, which was that really tedious decision. Before that, he knocked out Travis Brown in a fight where he got dropped a couple of times himself, and then before that, it was his triumphant return against Bigfoot Silva, who he knocked out before anything really happened. So he's another one where if he's not decimating the opposition, he really, really struggles to get anything going. It's because really he only really has the right hand. He doesn't have much of a threat in his left hook. He uses his low kicks a lot, but they're really only to set up like the right uppercut and the right straight. And then Josh Barnett, obviously. I'm a real sucker for Josh Barnett. I'll qualify that. I'm a real sucker for Josh Barnett when he's cage boxing. That's the best stuff that he's ever done. It's tremendous. The fights against Frank Mir and Roy Nelson were, you could put those in front of any MMA fighter and say that you can get better from watching that. The head positioning under the opponents, freeing up his hands to hit the body, using the cross face, the forearm across the throat to, just to piss people off. If you watch the Frank Mir fight, he puts in the cross face with the underhook and jams his forearm into Frank Mir's throat and lifts his head up. And Frank Mir tries to sort of like get his head off, get his neck off the crossface, and that's when the knee comes up and hits him in the head. Brutal. And he used the Jack Johnson uppercuts in that fight, where you turn your body sideways and you almost punch like an uppercut out to the side. So if you're standing straight onto the opponent, you turn your body to 9 o'clock and you swing your right uppercut through as if you're punching someone over on your left side. But the fist connects in front of you, obviously. It's one that Jack Johnson used to use. Really cool little uppercut. Tim Boetsch knocked out Yushin Okami with those, finished him with those rather. Just a nice way to get a full uppercut in a tiny space by turning your hips side on so that the punch gets the full range of motion as opposed to little bumping uppercuts on the inside. The famous losses of Barnett were obviously both while he was shooting in, actually. For as great a wrestler as he is considered, he's not a guy with like the wrestling pedigree of a Daniel Cormier or someone like that, and he's not a tremendously explosive guy. He's not gonna do the GSP shoot from halfway across the octagon and just drive through on the double leg. He's always been a much better clinch fighter and ground fighter than he is actually in the field of taking guys down. The Travis Brown loss was a hard one. That's when he got a little bit wobbled on the feet, actually, by, I think it was a left hook, I can't remember. But then he shot in on a leg, and that was when Travis Brown was introducing the world to those elbows that we all sort of watch and go, is that legal? And then eventually we decided they are. And then Lorenz Larkin knocked Neil Magny out with a couple of those the other day. They're brutal if you can get them in. I mean, every fighter should be working on that, because it really encourages fighters not to wall and stall with their head in a position where it can be elbowed, which can do a good deal to stop the threat of the opponent just pulling your hips out and dumping you on your butt for those brief sort of stalling out sessions along the fence. And then the other most notable recent loss was against Ben Rothwell, which again was shooting in, got caught with the go-go choke, the Rothwell guillotine on the Adam's apple or whatever it was. And he was very surprised. Everyone was surprised except Rothwell by that one. It's in the shooting, really. I mean, he doesn't set them up tremendously well. The Travis Brown one was a bit of a panic shot, but his boxing doesn't always flow well into his takedowns. He can be quite interesting on the feet, actually. When he busted up his hands against Daniel Cormier, he was doing lovely counter low kicks. He was getting behind his elbows, and he'd take the hands on like a cross guard or elbows up guard, like Archie Moore, and at the same time he'd hammer in the low kick on Cormier's lead leg. And he was doing a great job off of the bottom for a wrestler against Cormier. That's why I say, like, he's remembered as a wrestler, but he's really more of a grappler. It's not so much in the taking people down as excelling on the ground. I mean, he got out from under Big Nog. He threatened Big Nog with dozens of submissions. He probably would have broken Big Nog's leg if the time hadn't run out in one of their fights. Has great escapes from the bottom. He's really good with the elbow escape. When you take the opponent's elbow across your head from side control and you stiff arm it away at the tricep. The one that Marcelo Garcia is a master of. He's really good at that. So that should be a really fun fight. I think, I'm always going to advocate Barnett getting the fight to the fence, but I think low kicks on the outside, couple of shifts in with the left hooks on the way in, push to the fence, work the body. Arlovsky's takedown defense has always been stellar. So not so much worrying about the takedowns, but just draining him on the fence would be a great idea, because Arlovsky doesn't do so great in the later rounds. And anything he can do to sap the punching power in that one right hand is very important. For Arlovsky, keeping the distance is an important thing. To be honest, I'd like to see Arlovsky wait on this one. Just take a round and get Barnett confident coming in, and then look for either the straight right hands down the middle or the right uppercuts if he ducks his head in. Counter right hands as opposed to going on the lead and then ending up getting tied up or something like that. It should be a good fight. It's a heavyweight fight, so it could not be a good fight. It could just be 5 rounds of boring. But these guys, well, Barnett's very interesting in longer fights, and Arlovsky's very interesting in shorter fights. So you're pretty much set either way. I reckon that'll wrap us up for the week. I'm Jack Slack. This is Fights Gone By. Get to our Patreon. Give us a good review on iTunes. Anything you can to help us, and you'll have my eternal gratitude. And I'll catch you next Tuesday. Cheers.